NASA 557, contact tower 128.15.
Caution, caution. Manual, fuel, manual, fuel.
I'm John Goglia.
I'm Greg Fife.
And I'm Todd Curtis.
And we are the Flight Safety Detectives.
Between us, we have over a century of aviation accident investigation and safety experience to draw on as we discuss issues that affect all of us.
So we are qualified to share our perspectives on accidents and incidents and what can be learned from them for the future.
We're proud to say that we have two sponsors that really relate to the topic of aviation safety: the Professional Aviation Maintenance Association, or PAMA, and Avemco Insurance. Later on in the show, we'll tell you how you can get a 5% discount on your insurance just for listening to the show.
We don't just dissect the official reports. In every episode, we identify safety issues and take the mystery out of accident investigations.
So maybe pilots and their planes can have safer flights ahead.
Well, good morning, Todd. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine.
I guess it's you and I. Greg is off doing something.
And because of that, we can be creative in what we're going to talk about today.
Yes.
And
well, you sent me a report just a few hours ago about Air Canada's flight in Cincinnati. And although I didn't work that accident for the NTSB, it was before my time at the NTSB, I did work some of the aftermath of that accident, in as much as that was an accident that changed a lot of things in aviation. And one of the things that all the passengers flying today should be grateful for those people that perished, because they have, because of that accident, the repercussions of it led to massive changes inside the cabin of the airplane. So why don't we talk about the event? I'll let you lead off the event, and then we'll talk about my little piece of it, working with the FAA.
Very good. I will do that. This was a June 2nd, 1983 event involving an Air Canada DC-9, flight 797, that was taking off from Dallas en route to Toronto. En route, there was an onboard situation that led to an emergency landing at Cincinnati. In fact, there was a smoke and fire on board, and after landing, the airplane was able to land on all wheels. The smoke took over the aircraft, and they evacuated the aircraft. A number of the passengers and crew members were killed, but beyond that, this tragedy led to an understanding of the role that materials play in the airplane with respect to survivability in a fire. It also led to other changes in how crews deal with smoke and fire situations. And this gets to the part that you were involved with. But before we get to that, let me just go through the narrative here. The flight took off, nothing out of the ordinary. When they were en route, there was some sort of report from the flight attendant that there was a fire in the rear lavatory. And this was communicated to the captain. The captain made decisions to not immediately declare emergency or to land the aircraft, but waited some period of time. What was unclear to the pilot at that time was that there wasn't fire being reported, it was smoke being reported in the aft lavatory. And whether this would have changed the pilot's, the flight crew's decision-making as to what to do with the aircraft, there was a delay in making a request to land. They did make that request. They landed at the available airport, which was Cincinnati, rolled the aircraft to a stop, and only after it stopped did the smoke really take over the cabin, and they had issues with evacuating the airplane. Now, the report, which the NTSB report you'll have available on the page that for this website, for this episode, there is no public document, but there's quite a bit of information in the report. And among the pieces of information it said was that one of the flight crew members turned off the air conditioning packs and the air conditioning system in the belief that it was helping to fan the flames and make the smoke become more prominent. And in fact, that act allowed the smoke to build up very heavily within the cabin to the point that visibility was almost zero unless you were a couple of feet off the floor of the cabin. And this led to difficulties with evacuating the airplane. The smoke was so thick that roughly 60 to 90 seconds after they started the emergency evacuation, there was a flash fire inside the aircraft, but they couldn't see the flames. In fact, they couldn't see the flames until after a lot of the folks had left the aircraft. So they were in a very, very dire situation, and they were being hindered by the lack of visibility and by the toxic residue that was in the products from that fire. And this is where later on, there were actually some very, very significant changes across all aircraft in the United States and eventually around the world with respect to how you design the interior of the aircraft to be more resilient in the case of a cabin fire.
Yes, and that's where the work came in. Now, on the DC-9, the air conditioning system is in the tail of the airplane, and it pushes the air forward. And the outflow valve where the air leaves the airplane is also located back towards the tail of the airplane. So by turning the air conditioning off, it allowed the smoke to build because it wasn't exiting the airplane. There wasn't additional air being pumped in that would require any air to be exited. So it allowed it to build up. And if I remember right, the passengers were all moved forward away from the smoke for a brief period of time. And then the smoke filled the cabin and started to come down from the ceiling, like you said, to the floor. And many people were crawling on the floor to get off the airplane when they finally got the door open. And the crew was totally unaware of that because of terminology. If I remember right, from terminology from the flight attendants, the most accurate information wasn't transmitted up. I think there was a problem with the communications, the intercom system as well. But in any event, we wanted to talk about the interior of the airplane. So
before we go forward, I misspoke earlier when I said there were fatalities amongst the crew and passengers. Only passengers died in this event. There were 41 passengers on board total. 23 of them perished, and all 5 crew members did survive.
What happens when in this day in 1980s when you had a cabin fire? Well, the material that would burn inside a cabin is the rugs, the seats, the back and the cushion, the plastic sidewalls and the overhead, the hat racks I don't remember them having bins back then, but they may have, and the ceiling. And of course, all the wiring that's running around inside there. There's ducts for the air conditioning system, which the rubber type of material that they're made of would consume. So there was plenty of consumables on the airplane, and virtually none of which were fire resistant or fireproof. So as a result of this accident, a lot of work was done by the FAA Tech Center. Congress gave them a bunch of money to do some work. My friend Gus Sarkos was down there for the beginning of this. He was a young engineer in those days, and he did yeoman's duty trying to make changes to the system. And ultimately, within the next less than 10 years, which is very fast for the FAA, I think it was more like 7, to be honest with you, led to a lot of different changes. So the rugs on the airplane had to be changed to a different material that would be very difficult to burn and therefore wouldn't be emitting the gases. Now, what really kills the people in these type of cabin fires is the gases that are let off by the material that's burned. They're pretty toxic. And some of them are different than what you would have in a house fire. So it's not quite the same gas, but it really is immaterial because the results are the same. It's going to result in they don't support human life. So if you're in that environment, you're going to be in trouble. Right. So that's the rugs. One of the biggest contributors to this poisonous gas, and I'm not going to try to name these gases because they're words that I can't pronounce, but the seat cushion, the foam seat cushion, and the seat back, but mainly the cushion, gives, because it's 4 inches thick or so on the seats that we used back then, was just very, very toxic and very quick to ignite and burn. And again, like I said, the gases that give off when that cushion burns were fatal, almost instantly. If you got a good lung full of them, it was not life supporting. So that resulted in, that was probably the first item that was changed in the airplane because it was relatively quickly. What did we do? We actually put a seat cover under the seat cover. So all this foam material was encapsulated in a fireproof material, so that it would retard the cushions catching fire. And the yardstick was the 90 seconds to retard the fire, at least 90 seconds, so people could get out. And it actually exceeded the 90 seconds. I forget the exact numbers. But that was the very first thing that happened. The other thing that was also very, very hazardous to human health was the plastic sidewalls in the airplane. And that comes up the sidewall and includes the ceiling. When they burn, they also give off their own version of gas that's not good for human life. Collectively, the gases that were given off would just kill everybody.
And to that point, the Civil Aeromedical Institute in Oklahoma City did an analysis from both the survivors and the deceased, and they found that there were elevated levels of carbon monoxide. There's also cyanide found in the blood samples of the deceased, as well as fluoride. And so I don't know the effects of fluoride, but I've heard about cyanide since watching bad spy movies in the 60s, so that can't be good to a human being. But the biggest one, which is still a problem in all levels of aviation, is carbon monoxide, which tends to, unlike carbon monoxide actually binds chemically in such a way it prevents oxygen from exchanging in the lungs. So basically, any kind of carbon monoxide concentration at above a minimal level, you run the risk of having degraded human performance because your brain's simply not functioning because of lack of oxygen. And if you get too high, you'll be unconscious and dead before the fire gets to you.
Right. So as this investigation concluded and the research started at the FAA, one of the first, as I said, the first things that happened, and this was 3 years after the event, was to start to change all the seats and install seat blocking fireproof material into the seats. There was no substitute for the foam. I remember that from the work that we did. There was no good substitute for the foam. So we had to find a way to prevent the foam from igniting so easily. And that's what they came up with, these chemically treated seat covers. Both the material that they used was fire resistant and then chemically treated to even further reduce it so that the foam would not ignite so easily, because it could ignite without a flame, just high temperature. So that's one of the things they did. So the seat covers were temperature blocking so that the seat foam material wouldn't catch. So there was a massive campaign. Every seat in every airplane in the U.S. and in many countries outside of the U.S. had to be replaced. So that resulted in instant shortages of that material, which delayed the conversion. So I forget how many years it took for the conversion, but it was a while. But at least they jumped on that as a piece of low-hanging fruit, so to speak. to get that source of obnoxious gases out of the cabin, or delay it until the 90-second rule could take effect.
Now,
And
this
then,
is something that reminds me of this era when this happened. This is roughly 40 years ago. I wasn't yet in the aviation safety career field, but I was definitely interested in aviation. I definitely knew about this event. And one of the things that concerned me was when the news reports came out that, yes, these materials inside the aircraft can be highly toxic to passengers. My concern was, why don't they change them immediately? So what is the process for once a decision is made by the federal government saying this is the new standard? Do they do it immediately? Do they do it for new aircraft? How do they do it in this case?
this case is pretty standard. They give the industry time. So, and the industry in this case is the operators, the airlines that have existing airplanes, and it's the manufacturer who's building the airplanes. Now, the lead time for these materials is probably the biggest driver in all of this. You know, everybody, including me at the time, wanted it to be retrofitted a lot quicker. There just wasn't enough supply to make that happen. So as the bits and pieces came in, they would change out the airplanes. The airplanes would change them out. The manufacturers of the seats went after that material immediately for new seats. So within a very short period of time, relatively short period of time, all the new seats were covered with this fire blocking material. But it took a while to get enough covers, seat covers, I'll call them, to fit the airplanes. And I can remember changing out those seats many a night when the material became available. We would change them out. So that's a massive campaign when you think of how many airplanes and how many seats there are in an airplane. If we just take 100 seats per airplane, and we got 5,000 seats and 5,000 airplanes in the U.S., I mean, that's a massive amount of material. And so it was done, spread out over 2-3 year period.
And because it was a US standard, that meant in essence that any new aircraft, any newly manufactured aircraft that was sold in the US had to adhere to that standard. So Airbus aircraft, Boeing aircraft, Douglas aircraft didn't really matter. It became a world standard essentially because the US made it a US standard. And that is historically been the way a lot of changes happen in aviation. One of the major players, either the Europeans or the Americans, make a change that becomes standard. Everyone has to follow suit.
Yes. Yes. So that was the seats. Then we also tackled the sidewalls and the rugs. So, and if I remember right, the rugs came pretty quickly because it was, they were all synthetic, and it was a case of chemically treating the rugs to slow down the fire. So essentially, if I remember right, the fire testing for the rugs were that they wouldn't support combustion on their own. If you held a torch under them and under the rug, it would burn. But if you took the torch away, the source of flame away, it would quickly die out. So the rugs would change at the same time. So just think of how many miles of rugs in airplanes that were done. That's not only where you walk, it's underneath the seats as well. So it's like three times what you see when you're walking down the aisle. So those also came along. The sidewalls were much more difficult. And some airlines took very unique ways to deal with the sidewalls. The requirement, if I remember right, was when the airplanes came in for interior refurbishment, which we did on a pretty regular basis, because with all the people flying, the interiors really do take a beating. It required, when you refurbish them, to upgrade them. But what some airlines were doing is sidewalls crack all the time back then, not so much today, but back then there was sidewalls were cracking. A little kid, if he gave it a good whack, might even crack it. The right spot, the right time. So anyway, some airlines, and I remember one of the major airlines in the US, would, every time they did any maintenance on the airplane that required the sidewalls to be removed, they would replace them with the new fire blocking materials. So they had a fleet that was slowly being updated prior to the date of FAA required completion. So there was some that did it that way. There was other airlines that waited until they did a complete cabin refurbishment and came in and just cleaned out the entire interior of the airplane and replaced all the sidewalls. But in any event, if I remember right, the early 90s, that was all done. So after that point, the ability for passengers to survive these crashes had climbed quite a bit. You know, and most people don't realize that, and this is a today's statistic, that 92% of the airplane accidents happen right on the airport or right adjacent to the airport, and they are survivable. They're usually runway overruns or undershooting the runway. They're survivable. So by having the material, fire blocking material throughout the cabin, increases the time and increases the survival rate. And I tell people all the time when I'm flying, when I see them, when you fly, you should have a good pair of shoes on your feet that are laced so that they don't come off. Because one of the things that I saw in a number of accidents was the people that were fatal, their shoes were off. In the shake and bake that's going on inside the airplane, when you leave the runway, some reason the shoes come off. And if you survive that, you're going to run across maybe broken metal, shads of metal, torn metal, even metal that's hot from a fire, other sources of hot material. So, I mean, one of the best things you can do for yourself is listen to the FAA when you're flying and use a good pair of shoes on your feet, tie shoes so that they don't come off. Well, boots could do the same thing. They don't come off so easily, boots. All right, natural fabric clothes. Everybody should be flying in things like blue jeans or other pants made with natural fabric, and also the top, and give yourself every edge possible. Every edge possible. Because like I said, 92% are survivable. What you want to do is get out. Now, I've been involved with a few accidents that were very much survivable, but people took too long to get out of the seats. When that airplane comes to rest, you need to be moving. Get off the airplane. Don't take your bags with you. There's nothing that frustrates me more when I saw crashes like the Asiana runway crash in San Francisco, which is a good example, that he crashed on the airport, went sliding down. Everybody survived, everybody. And there are pictures with people coming off the airplane, hauling their baggage, their carry-on baggage. And that could have cost people behind them those precious seconds to get off. Unfortunately, on that airplane, 2 young ladies died from rescue equipment because they weren't seen by the rescuers and they were hit with the equipment. So that was a very unfortunate set of circumstances. But the biggest point in what I'm trying to say here is we've made interiors of the airplanes a lot safer, a lot more fireproof. We've also looked at head injuries, and oftentimes I'm flying with people, and in the certain rows of seats near the bulkheads, they have inflatable seat belts, and that's meant to keep you from slamming forward into the bulkhead to protect your head. That's a HIC, we call it, head impact event. So the interiors of the cabins have really been updated over the last 40 years to provide the passenger a very, very, very high level of likelihood of surviving these runway overruns, I'll call them. And so that is one very big plus for the safety of the traveling public. It came at the expense of some people in previous accidents. It was expensive for the airlines to retrofit all those airplanes. Now it's just part of the airplanes coming out of the factory, but it really has made a major difference in the survival rate.
A couple other things about this accident that didn't have as much of a long-term impact was one of the things that struck me is that the NTSB did not find a source of the fire. It was first noted, well, the smoke was in the rear lavatory, but there's no real evidence of what started it, whether it was an equipment situation, whether it was a cigarette. And by the way, this was 1983. Smoking was very much allowed in airlines. And in fact, in the early 70s was the first time, I believe, any kind of airline had specific non-smoking sections. So, those of you who enjoy not being in a smoky cabin when you're flying across country, not so long ago, that was the case. And for non-smokers like myself, being seated even near the smoking section was something I tried to avoid at any given time.
Yes, there was an issue raised, and I forget exactly now the issue around smoking, but whether Air Canada prohibited smoking, and they think that it was a case of smoking in the lavatory. So I remember that part of it, and so it may have been that Air Canada didn't allow the smoking.
And this is also the era where smoke detectors in the lavatories were not only not common, they were not required.
Right, they were not required at the time. It was a result of this accident that ultimately we did require them in the cabin. And then with when no smoking became very widespread, we had another problem that came up. Passengers would come in there and take the batteries out of the smoke detector so that they could stay in the lavatory and smoke. And they wouldn't put the batteries back in. So that caused us lots of issues to have to deal with. And hence the federal law that says that if you tamper with the smoke detector, it's a federal offense. So you see the flight attendants used to say that on the briefing. I haven't heard that in a long time. So the issue the smoking issue is diminished since so many people now don't smoke.
And for you vapors out there, vaping is also prohibited on board airliners.
Yeah, I find vaping actually more offensive than the smoke sometimes. So we can thank this accident, all of us that travel, we can thank it for raising us a level of safety for travel and for running into problems with fires on board the airplane. Now, you mentioned the cause of the accident. So back in the lavatory, we have that paper trash, which was some people, investigators believe that's what happened. A cigarette went into that and started a fire. Others believe that it may have been the wiring for the lavatory pump, electric motor driven pump in the lavatory. And that actually led to the current airplanes use a vacuum system. They actually use the pressurization in the airplane to vent it overboard to drive a motor. So the air running through, it's an air motor, like a tools in a shop where you go in and get your car and they take your wheels off. They use an impact wrench. It's driven by an air hose. So much the same concept, but they're using cabin pressure that's vented towards outside the airplane to drive an air motor, which will do the flush motor, which will drive the waste into the storage tank. So there were some people that believed that, and there's also a bunch of wiring behind the mirrors in the wall in the back of the lavatory that some people thought that could have caused a problem. And most of us in maintenance didn't believe that, because that's an area that we very seldom see any problems with. So we just didn't believe that was it. Many of us believed it was the flush motor more than the cigarette. But in any event, it started in the lavatory, and it led to all those changes. Now, those changes were very expensive. The fire blocking material at the time was current state-of-the-art technology, which whenever you have a new product developed like that, it's expensive. The sidewalls, same thing, new formulas for the plastic, initially very expensive. So the airlines and the manufacturers spent a lot of money upgrading the cabins to make sure that we had an increased chance of surviving.
And the other fortunate thing, if there's anything fortunate about this, is that this event occurred in a country that has a tradition of having fairly extensive research into the accident investigation and where their findings could have an impact on aviation around the world. So if this event had happened in Canada, the UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, there were very likely been a similar effect around the world of airlines following suit and doing this. Now, that's not to say it wouldn't have happened elsewhere, but unfortunately, that's how aviation goes, in that each individual country where an event occurs, they're responsible for doing the accident investigation. Some, like the United States, will pour sometimes tens of millions of dollars into an investigation for any number of reasons. Other countries, not so much.
Yes. Most people don't know it, but the TWA 800 event that occurred off Long Island in the 1996, the NTSB invested about $50 million into that investigation. Extensive testing. I mean, they really left no stone unturned on that one. I was there for that, and that was, we tightened our budget belt considerably on that because that really was a strain on our budget.
And I was at Boeing at the time, and believe me, there was quite a bit of support from the manufacturer on that investigation as well.
Yes. Well, we have a unique industry where people will pull together when they see the threat. You know, sometimes it just, you know, the discussion stop, the differences of opinions in discussion stops, and everybody focuses down saying, we got to do something. We got to get this done. So that's the benefit of having a good aviation, good, robust aviation safety program.
And I think that segues this into the last word that came to me a few minutes ago, in that this is literally a 40-plus-year-old event. And even 40 years later, even if we don't learn anything technologically from the investigation, it's good to understand what role some events have in changing the direction of aviation around the world. And this is one of those impactful events. Yes, it killed a few people. It didn't kill hundreds of people. It didn't involve high-level celebrities or politicians or occur in a major metropolitan area. But because of the circumstances and how the industry focused on this, it led to some very positive changes. And that's the kind of thing, as John was mentioning, doesn't matter what part of aviation you're in. If a problem is seen, very many of the participants, whether they're friends or foes, will get together and solve it. Even if it takes, in this case, years to implement those changes.
Yes. Well, I guess I get the last word, and I'll go back to my standard. All our pilots, it's still painful for us as we did the research on this one, how many general aviation accidents that we looked at where the circumstances and facts were just the same all over again. So if you're a pilot and you're going to fly, do a good job of pre-planning your flight. Make sure you know the weather, where you're going, where you're leaving from, and everything in between. You know, we still run airplanes out of fuel, so let's take a good look at, make sure we have enough fuel. Let's not be concerned about spending an extra $50 for fuel. And after you get out on the airplane on the tarmac, do a good pre-flight. If you don't know, or if you have any questions about your pre-flight, get a mechanic that works on the airplane. Most mechanics I know will be glad to show you what a good pre-flight is like. And then after you get in the air, put that head on a swivel. And mid-airs and near mid-airs are still pretty prevalent today in around general aviation airports because we have so many students out there flying. And with that, I'll say, please, please fly safely.
Thank you for checking out our show. We really value our listeners and subscribers. Our podcast gets ranked by you and how much you like it. So please give us 5 stars in your podcast platform.
We want to keep in contact with you. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, YouTube.
You can email the show at flightsafetydetectives@gmail.com. By the way, if you're on YouTube, we're really working on growing the channel, and it helps if you all send in comments. Please do that, and we read all the comments.
And be sure to subscribe. Remember, if you're in the market for aviation insurance, you can save 5% with Avemco just by mentioning our show. Visit them at www.avemco.com. That's it for this episode of the Flight Safety Detective. Until the next episode, fly safe.